Asserting central presence immediately sets the stage for ambitious development. Initiating development, black immediately stakes a claim on the central light squares and prepares to connect rooks later. Developing the knight to f3 shores up the center and prepares for kingside castling, while still keeping options open for further pawn advances or central expansion. Preparing to develop the bishop, black solidifies the center's influence and anticipates a king's Indian setup. Solidifying the kingside and preparing for a fianchetto, this move opens diagonals for the bishop while creating a robust pawn shield. Unleashing a queenside pawn storm promises aggressive development, but it might leave the king exposed to a kingside assault. Developing the bishop here bolsters the kingside while keeping the pawn structure flexible. Challenging white's central pawn structure, black boldly expands queenside, eyeing potential breaks while developing its dark-squared bishop to a more active diagonal. Securing the king is paramount, and this castling frees the rook for central engagement. Boldly challenging the center, black aims to shatter white's pawn structure and open lines for rapid piece development. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain is a sensible defensive posture, preventing a pawn break by black and solidifying white's central control. Embracing central tension, black liberates the pawn chain and prepares to challenge white's space advantage. Recapturing opens the c-file for potential queenside pressure and maintains a solid pawn structure. Developing the bishop to its natural square, preparing to castle and consolidate the pawn structure. Aiming for queenside pressure, this bishop exchange would liberate black's pieces. Securing the king's immediate safety is paramount before engaging in further central struggles or piece activity. Unleashing the queen aims to control the central dark squares and pressure the queenside pawn structure. Shifting pressure, the queen eyes weaknesses on the queenside and prepares to support potential pawn advances. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces control of the d5 square and prepares for potential central pawn pushes. Striking out towards the queenside, black aggressively seeks space and aims to dislodge the knight before white can consolidate. The knight's journey to the rim is a strategic gamble, aiming to disrupt black's queenside expansion and exploit potential weaknesses on the file. Shifting the queen to attack along the a6-f1 diagonal creates an immediate diagonal threat, putting pressure on white's kingside development and central pawns. Knight hops to a dominating central outpost, pressuring a key square. Sacrificing the queen to dismantle white's central pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces creates dynamic play. Trading knights clears the central tension and simplifies the position, leading towards an endgame where piece activity will be paramount. Sacrificing the bishop simplifies into an endgame where black's queen is awkwardly placed, potentially sacrificing tempo for dubious material gain. Relocating the king clears a pathway for the rook and solidifies the central pawn structure, preparing for a strategic endgame. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies the center and prepares for future pawn advances, aiming to exploit white's slightly awkward knight placement. Solidifying the center's pawn structure while preparing to develop the kingside pieces allows white to maintain a balanced position. Asserting pressure on the c-file, black aims to destabilize white's pawn structure and activate their rook. Fortifying the c-file is a pragmatic step, preparing for potential pawn advances and eyeballing black's queenside ambitions. Asserting pressure on the queenside, this knight aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate key squares. Sacrificing the bishop opens the g-file, creating long-term attacking prospects and putting pressure on black's kingside. Opening the g-file dramatically weakens the king's shelter, but it also unlocks attacking possibilities down that newly created corridor. Seizing open lines, white prepares to occupy the crucial central files and press on black's weakened kingside structure. Unleashing the pawn to solidify control of the central squares, while preparing to challenge the open file. The knight retreats, preparing to redeploy and contest the central squares, while bolstering the e3 pawn's defense. Exchanging rooks now opens the c-file for black's remaining pieces, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure. Reclaiming the open file solidifies white's central control and prepares for future pawn advances, though black's pieces are now more mobile. Exploiting the doubled pawns offers a chance to equalize the pawn structure. Opening the file creates an outpost for your rook and pressures black's isolated queenside pawn. Opening the center now aims to exploit the slightly uncoordinated white pieces and create active play for the bishop pair. This rook outpost severely cramps black's queenside and limits piece mobility. Relocating the king to a more secure central square offers improved defensive coverage for potential threats. Asserting queenside space while potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure. Asserting queenside presence, black immediately challenges white's centralized pawn and opens avenues for counterplay. An audacious gambit for king's side space, aiming to disrupt black's potential pawn storm. Securing the king's central position offers newfound safety and opens pathways for counterplay. Shifting the king to a more central post offers better defensive coordination and prepares potential pawn advancements. Bringing the bishop to d6 aims to activate this piece and potentially pressure white's queenside, but it could also become a target if white can advance pawns. The rook slides to the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and establish a menacing outpost. The rook retreats, aiming to contest the open file and potentially support the isolated d. Pawns advance, seeking active counterplay. Securing the 7th rank with the rook forces black's pieces into passive defensive positions. Pushing that rook forward creates immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the open c-file and disrupt white's coordination. Unlocking the central files demands a bold pawn thrust, aiming to splinter black's consolidated defense. Gaining tempo while opening lines and forcing the opposing king into a more active, yet exposed, role. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines for your active king, creating dynamic imbalances. Unleashing a furious kingside sortie, the rook demands immediate attention, disrupting the monarch's sanctuary and threatening further chaos. Chasing the enemy king's safety requires a delicate balance. Here, the white king ventures too far, exposing itself to immediate checks. Attempting to secure the d-file for a potential queen re-entry, but it risks exposing the king further. Securing the central pawn is a solid, albeit passive, step, prioritizing consolidation over immediate action. Retrieving the rook to its starting square aims to solidify the king's defense and potentially prepare for a central pawn push. Seizing the exposed pawn opens a dynamic endgame, forcing black to actively defend their isolated queenside structure. Consolidating the king onto the safer g-file, preparing to counterattack the isolated pawn. The king's exposed position now faces immediate king hunt tactics. Relocating the monarch to the kingside offers a measure of safety, a prudent choice given the pawn structure's vulnerabilities. Activating the rook on the flank reasserts pressure and aims to disrupt black's coordination before the king fully escapes. Aggressively repositioning the bishop, aiming to contest the vital diagonal and disrupt white's king safety. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, eyeing black's vulnerable queenside pawns and pressuring the king's escape route. The rook's journey up the rank is a bold attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and threaten the king. The knight's daring foray forces the black king out of cover, potentially exposing it to devastating attacks across the open board. Exposing the king to potential discovered attacks, this maneuver forfeits the crucial pawn shield, leaving it precariously positioned. Securing the 7th rank is paramount, preventing the black king from finding sanctuary on the queenside and preparing to exploit the open files. The rook's sacrifice on the h-file initiates a risky but potentially decisive pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Pouncing on the undefended pawn, white aims to clear a path for the rook and disrupt black's defensive setup. Sacrificing material to disrupt the opponent's defensive setup and potentially open lines against the king is a bold gamble. The knight returns to a powerful outpost, aiming to disrupt Black's now exposed monarch and control key squares. A desperate pawn race is on, but the exposed Black king offers the immediate path to victory. Sacrificing the rook now allows the knight to exploit its central dominance, forcing an exchange and simplifying into a favorable knight and pawn endgame.